A childhood friend of mine wrote a book called The Leading Causes of Life. Gary Gunderson is his name, and he once described me as the other half of his childhood, and that was pretty accurate. And I was amazed and delighted to know that his co-author, Larry Pray, was a childhood friend of Barb Royal. So it's amazing how these connections are woven throughout our lives. Gary and Larry wrote The Leading Causes of Life to lift up the things that seem to be happening when life flourishes. And in days like these, when it seems at every turn that we are met with the messages of despair, we need to turn our attention to what it is that makes life thrive, that causes life to flourish. They suggest that the leading causes of life, that there are 5, and I'm going to rattle them off really fast and then talk about each one. Connection, coherence, agency, blessing, and hope. There is an ensemble quality to these 5 causes of life. It's actually hard to discover one without discovering the others there as well. If you think, for example, about Habitat for Humanity, where there's this ensemble quality to the work that we join together in doing to build a house for a family in need. You've got all of these coming together. And it's that all of them coming together that really are causes of life. And as we know from our partnership with Habitat for Humanity last month and this month, it really causes things to happen, good things to happen, when we have this ensemble, this blending of connection and coherence and agency, blessing, and hope. Habitat for Humanity has built millions of houses all over the world, and yet it's just a few people helping a family build a house. But multiply that again and again and again, and you have quite a story of life flourishing. Connection. Connections matter, and in fact, that's the name of an organization here in Des Moines that I've just learned about in the past week. And the idea that connections matter is based on the research that I described to you last Sunday in my sermon about the importance of connections, that the world is filled with overcoming by the relationships that we build. And there are people in this congregation who are involved with community matters, connections matter. And in fact, our director of religious education, Tracy Beck, is one of the founders and is deeply involved in this organization. Connectionsmatter.org. Check it out. I talked last week about the importance of relationships to health. And connections are relationships. That's what Gunderson and Pray mean when they talk about connections as a cause of life. Relationships are important to other ways in which a society thrives. I think one of the best examples from my own experience is the engagement that I had over the last 2 years with an organization called the Church for All People in Columbus, Ohio. I got involved with the Church for All People because one of the members of the Columbus UU congregation came to me with the idea that we might get volunteers to work in this impoverished area of downtown that was a highly multicultural area. It had people of color who were living in the urban blight, and it had people who were white, who were from Appalachia, who had moved in hopes of finding work in the urban center. And this was a cheap area to live. It was an impoverished neighborhood. The housing had been terrible, but the story gets better. And much of the improvement in this neighborhood of poor people had come about over the last 10 years because of the work of the Church for All People. And this was a Methodist church, United Methodist Church affiliated with the United Methodist denomination. And it had started because a few people decided it would be really good to have some sort of presence in this impoverished neighborhood. So 12 years ago, 10 years when I entered the story, they had set up a free store where they just basically gave things away. And they had a little tiny place where they would open several times a week and give things away. And then John Edgar, the minister who was behind this initial connection, began to form relationships with the people who were coming into the free store. And he began by listening to them about what they needed. And one of the things they said is, hey, we need a church down here that really is open to hearing what we need in this neighborhood. And so they started meeting in the back room of a laundromat. And it was a church, John Edgar decided, that would be for all people. And that meant that no matter what religious attitudes people brought, and it's an overtly Christian church, but no matter what theological views people brought, everyone was going to be welcome, including, for example, gays and lesbians and transgender people. Now, this was a big step for a Methodist church. And yet, the determination about being truly a church for all people is that all people are the children of God. This was the attitude. And it actually drove their behavior to be welcoming to all and to be in an attitude of listening and connection. And through building these relationships with people and encouraging those who attended the church to build relationships, gradually the people with the resources like John Edgar and the Methodist connections that he had came to see that there were ways to be of real value, to make real efforts that would be meaningful in this impoverished neighborhood, while they were also trying to blend together a congregation that came to include not only black people and white people, but poor people and wealthy people, because it turned out they weren't that far from one of the most wealthy neighborhoods in Columbus. And some of those people, seeing what was going on there, began to attend. So fast forward to 12 years later. This church, in this impoverished neighborhood, starting in little more than the back room of a laundromat, gradually came to create connections that led to the development of improved housing. They actually, in the 40-block radius around the church, they rehabilitated 35% of the buildings, the residences in the neighborhood, and made sure they were available, affordably available, to the people who lived in the neighborhood. This was not gentrification. This was finding ways so that the people who lived in terrible conditions in the neighborhood could live in good conditions. And there was a free store, a bigger free store, and a food pantry, a fresh food produce pantry. There were health classes and classes for moms with new babies. And all of these things that happened didn't happen because they came in with a program and said, this is what we're going to do. They happened because the people who were pivotal in founding the church established relationships with the community and literally began to map the assets, to see the assets that were in the community. And one of the greatest assets in the community was the people the people that everyone who was not a member of this neighborhood sort of dismissed as being poor and troubled and struggling, and therefore really not an asset, but a problem to be solved. But it turns out those people who were the stakeholders in their neighborhood really were the ones who found the solutions that they needed. And then using connections that John Edgar and others in leadership were able to bring, they were able to engage the Children's Hospital and a foundation that provided support for some of the efforts that they were engaged in. And it was amazing to me to see what they had done, to tour some of the rehabbed houses, to hear about the programs to move people from being deeply in debt to being able to buy a home and get a home mortgage loan. And all of that came from listening, from being in relationship, from the connections that John Edgar and the other leaders in the church had with the people in the community. One of the most important learning pieces that I and others from the Unitarian Church in Columbus had based on our relationship with this congregation was the need that people have to be in relationship, authentic relationship, with others whose participation offers them hope. So this was white middle class UUs coming to have conversation with people at the Church for All People who were waiting to get into the free store because you had to take a number, who were waiting for their health class to learn about better healthy eating, who were waiting for their turn to go in and get fresh produce. It just made a difference that someone who was success was happy to be in conversation with someone who was living on the street and homeless. To be able to really listen and really be fully present to those struggling people made a difference in their lives. And it was actually, we always, I think we UUs in particular, think that we can fix things. And to recognize that we may not be able to fix things, but one of the things we can bring is our presence. And it actually gave people hope because they saw these white middle class people treating them like human beings, really seeing them and being open to conversations. It made a tremendous difference in their lives. John Edgar said to me, "Look, I know your people want to be helpful, but honestly, there's probably nothing more significant that they can do than to learn to have authentic relationships with people who are so different, who are struggling, who are suffering, who need to know that someone cares." So all of the programs that emerged from this effort in this impoverished multicultural area of Columbus were built on this idea that we need to be in relationship. So I think what that says is that the leading causes of life are actually present in any community that may fit all of the statistics for a blighted, impossible to solve urban problem. But people need to go out into the community and find what it is that can be encouraged to fan the flames of hope and connection and coherence and agency and blessing. Coherence, that's an interesting word. Gunderson and Pray, what they mean by coherence is a sense of purpose and meaning in life. We all seek coherence in our lives. But it's more than that. It's actually living our cherished values, integrating them with the things we do on a daily basis, finding the relationship between our aspirations and what we do. And in this effort of the Church for All People, it was as if I was seeing all of the values of Unitarian Universalism on display in a Methodist church. Ouch. I really had a little bit of a dark night of the soul thinking, what are we doing? And why can't Unitarian Universalism nurture something like what I'm seeing at the Church for All People? And, I don't think I know the answer to that question, but I think that there is hope that we can learn from what the Church for All People is doing. And really, it's what values do we talk about, right? And how can we arrange our lives so that our lives speak those values? That's coherence, when we're living in accordance with our values. And based on what I learned from John Edgar and the Church for All People, some of it is just letting go of the idea that we know what the solutions are, and looking instead to the communities that are most at risk and beginning to be in relationship with them so that we can live our values by hearing what they think will work. Agency. Agency is a simple notion that what we do matters and that we can do more than we think. Agency is a notion that came out of the humanist movement that began 500 years ago during the Protestant Reformation. And agency is just the idea that, in the Christian context, is the idea that our hands are the hands of God, that we do important work in our setting, our place, our world, and that God works through us. And so in Christianity, humanism was a heretical notion that we were actually important and what we did actually mattered. And it was, it's changed its meaning, since it's not the same as when we say humanism today. We're often thinking about the humanist movement that began in the 1930s in America. That began right here, in fact. But the idea is simple. It's that what we do matters. And everyone needs to have a sense that what they do matters, a sense of agency. When I was still doing international development work as a lawyer and still being a law professor, I had the opportunity to teach students who were taking courses at Harvard. These were foreign students who had come to Harvard Law School. They'd been admitted to the Master's in Law program to learn more about some of the concepts of law that would help them when they went back to their countries to build a positive legal infrastructure. And I had the best time teaching these students. And there were 3 students, though, that I just adored more than any. They were students from Malawi. And of those 3, one of them was everyone's favorite, a young man named William, who was just so positive and bright and cheerful and loving. And he was wonderful. And he got sick. He got sick, and we got him into the hospital. Excuse me. Speaking of overcoming, I came down with a cold last week, but I'll try not to let that stop me. Ultimately, William checked himself out of the hospital, and he went back to Malawi. And I didn't understand it then, because I thought, why doesn't he want to stay here where the health care is so good? But the word I heard from his fellow countrymen was that he needed to go home. No one knew what was wrong with him, but he needed to go home. It turns out that he went home to die because he had AIDS. something that people didn't understand very well, and something that was very not at all well accepted in Africa. But he wanted to be with his family when he went home to die. All over Africa, people who had moved to the cities came back to their villages to die, to be with their families. And there were, in every village, so many babies who had survived their parents' death and didn't have anyone to take care of them, except that they did. So, part of the story is that the big healthcare foundations and the big generous donors all around the world wanted to do something about the issue of AIDS in Africa. They wanted to help. This is that wonderful impulse that helps us to live our values. But what they discovered when they did the first small study to figure out what they might do to help is that without any money and without any, good communication systems, African women in these villages were already doing what needed to be done to help. They were taking care of the moms who were dying. They were taking care of the young men who came back to their villages to die. And they were taking care of the babies and seeing that they got schooling and clothing and care and love. And so the big foundations discovered that there was already a network in place to help with the problem of AIDS in Africa, to bring life, to look at the problem as one of encouraging life and encouraging the flourishing of these young children who otherwise, without help, would have simply died. And ultimately, when the antiretroviral drugs were discovered, despite the fact that there were a lot of people still talking about how getting AIDS is a sign that God has condemned you, those networks of women in villages became the networks for the distribution of the antiretroviral drugs. In other words, it wasn't rich white people coming from the outside who began to cope and encourage the survival and the flourishing of life when the AIDS epidemic struck. It was the people in the community who already took agency, who decided that what we do matters, who began to live their values of family and community and love and blessing. Blessing. Blessing is a word that has some mixed meanings in our world today. Sometimes it's regarded as simply from a theological point of view, as something that comes from God. And yet, it's got a much broader meaning in so many communities. A blessing is something we can give to other people. All of us are capable of blessing others' lives. Larry Pray tells a story about how after he had a stroke, he was in a support group. And one of the women worked in a flower shop, one of the women in the support group. And at every meeting, she'd come, and he recalls especially how she had brought some roses that were left over and that weren't going to be sold, so she brought them along to give to people in the group. But there weren't enough roses for everyone in the group. So the group talked together about who in the group most needed the blessing of the gift of a white rose. And that moment was the community gathered in love and support to bless those the community understood most needed blessing. It was a very powerful moment for Larry. And yet, it's just a single incident, a single example of the ways in which people can bless one another. The last cause of life is hope. Larry and Gary are very quick to say that this means informed hope, not some magical thinking hope. And this is the story that I like best as an example of informed hope. Diane was a church member in a little church on the outskirts of Memphis. And there were a lot of kids from a very poor neighborhood who were part of the church. And she got to know these kids, really got to know them, got to know their names, and she was delighted by their vivacity and their intelligence and their sense of humor and their liveliness. And she said to herself, any one of these kids could be on the honor roll if they just had the kind of support that they need. So what she did was go and visit the schools of each one of those kids. And with all the kids in the congregation, it turned out she had to visit 36 different schools. She talked to the principals of each one, and she said, this kid and this kid and this kid who go to your school, they are really bright, but they're going to need our support. And if anything happens, you know, if they get in trouble or if they're struggling academically, you call me and let me know. This is informed hope. It's the hope that these kids can have a successful academic life, that they can have a better life because they do succeed in school. But it's informed by understanding what it's going to take to support these kids through their early years of learning and through high school. And the church developed a tutoring program so that their church was a site for kids who really needed extra help in school. And they got enough volunteers and enough tutors so that the kids actually did succeed. Hope, but not amorphous, wishful thinking. Hope that's grounded in the reality and an awareness of what needs to happen next. And these are the leading causes of life. This ability to combine connection and coherence and agency and blessing and hope. And it's not like it takes an effort to combine them, because you start with any one of them and you can develop, the others will develop. It's a kind of synergy. Near the entrance to the Apartheid Museum in South Africa is a tiny sign that says, we all share the same African ancestor. And that's scientifically true. It's a fact that is meaningless until there is action connected with it, action rooted in the causes of life. And so, though it may have seemed impossible at one time, apartheid in South Africa ended. And although nothing's perfect, there are lives flourishing today that once were doomed to be blighted, because people took steps together to build relationships and live their values, to make sure that people in the blighted communities had the opportunity to claim the agency that they so needed in their lives, and yet supported that through blessing and through informed hope. Just like the Church for All People 12 years ago, starting a free store in an impoverished neighborhood, worked miracles. To me, coming to see it 10 years after they started, they just seemed like miracles. What did it take? It took being in authentic relationship, discovering the community's assets because of those relationships, acting in ways that multiplied the connections and the coherence and the agency and the blessing and hope. This is not a program for any church or any group. It is simply a reality that life flourishes when we find a way to make it possible for these 5 leading causes of life to emerge from what seems to be despair. In every relationship we have, in every connection we have, there is the possibility that these leading causes of life will emerge. And all I ask of us is that we look for them, and we build on them, and we live our lives in a way that expresses our deepest values. Life. It's always there, even when you read the headlines about despair. Let us embrace life.